this is much larger than my presentation when I was undergrad. Only 3 people showed up. Like somebody is popular. Thank you so much for being here. The weather is not cooperative, but you all showed up. For those of you online, we are starting our program now. And also thank you for joining us from parts of the world that the weather is not as difficult as we have here. I think it is, let me see here. What the temperature is in Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa, it's 14 degrees. In Dhaka, Bangladesh, it's 19 degrees. In Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, it's 27 degrees. Here in Antigonish, it's minus 18. We're very proud of our weather. So, before we are done here for only one purpose, to listen to Emma. But before we do that, Emma would like to do land acknowledgement, as she usually does. And then what I will do is I will walk you through the course outline, what we have been doing. Emma and I have been doing the course called Peacebuilding in the 21st Century. And then I will hand it to Emma, and Emma will walk us through her knowledge and her expertise in peacebuilding. So, Emma.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Oh my goodness, this is like all my friends, and this is wonderful. Today we are gathered in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples. Here in Nalagitchkanagitch, meaning place where branches are torn off, where bears reach for beech nuts, Indigenous peoples have been living in vital, intimate relationships with this land, these beach, these waters, these winds since time immemorial. This matters not only because many of us are settlers or have newly arrived, but because we are all entangled in what we refer to as ecology. The trees whose exhale becomes our inhale, the minerals that mediate our digestion and our neural pathways, the water circulating through our bodies in almost the same proportion do they circle Earth. At this very moment, Mi'kma'ki is a living metabolism, arms outstretched, giving us the capacity to gather, to think, to feel, and to know in this moment. Acknowledging this, I want to linger for a moment in the space that opens after honest recognition of land, because land acknowledgements are easy to say, but they ask quietly something of us. Something like, how will you show up now that you remember where you stand? And what does this place need from you in return?
Thank you, Emma. So I will quickly walk you through. This is not about me, this is all about Emma. But I'm going to introduce the course outline so you know what we're attempting to cover. So it's on week 1, we covered theory of peace, conflict, and violence, examination of positive and negative peace. On the same week, we also covered history of peace building and structural approaches to sustainable peace building. On week 2, we covered post-World War II international institutions and peace building architecture. And the same week also covered UN peacekeeping success and challenges. On week 3, NGO and grassroots peace building. On week 4, conflict transformation, key aspects of peace building. On week 5, we covered Ubuntu, indigenous philosophy and concepts. Also, we covered environmental peace building briefly. On week 7, identity-based conflict and human needs. On week 8, intergenerational transmission of memory, social media and impact on violence and peace building. Next week, we covered narratives, war, violence, and peace. And finally, we covered genocide. Very interesting topic. So these are the issues more or less we have covered. This one semester course is very diverse. It is we just scratched the surface. So with that, before I hand to Emma, this morning I asked Emma how she wants to be introduced. This is what she sent me. Daughter, sister, and friend. Emma?
Thank you. I'll have to make a confession before I begin. I'm gonna do a presentation today and it'll be delivered by my voice, but what it really is a collection of all of yours. I have this amazing constellation here of all these stars, most of which are in the room, but some of which that consist of philosophers, poets, co-workers, friends, family. These people have sat with me literally and figuratively for hours, and they sit with me in what we'll begin to talk about. They offer words and silence, and they don't rush me to move to solutions. They don't push me to find answers, but they allow me and hold my hand to walk through my path that I choose to take. Beho Akamofe says, "The times are urgent, let us slow down." Not to be passive, but because the doorway into different futures is often found in the places we rush past. So before diving into peace building and conflict transformation, I want to invite us to slow down. To notice that this gathering right now is happening within a much larger conversation that began long before we were born. Peace is not something we build from scratch. Conflict is not simply out there. And we are not separate from the conditions that we'll be talking about today. So I find myself wondering, what can I offer Mi'kma'ki in this moment? Possibly an interpretation of my personal understanding, an interruption of our efficiency-driven lives. But most importantly, what I'd like to offer today is an invitation to expand our field of relationality with land. Because we have been experiencing a relational and ecological breakdown, we require a way of tending to relationships that have been frayed, a way of participating in the healing and the very world that we are woven from, a way of participating in the healing. And today, my talk will imitate Elder Albert Marshall's teachings of Etowaktamak. Two-eyed seeing offers a profound orientation, and he reminds us that it is a verb and not a noun, a living spirit rather than a concept, which invites us to braid the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing with Western ways of knowing in good relation. To learn to see with many eyes, to respond to the complexity of this moment with humility, and to recognize ourselves, not as outside observers, but as living participants in both harm and healing. What we are living through now is a convergence of crisis. It is an unraveling of a particular worldview, a worldview often named modernity. Our modern condition, our colonial and often Eurocentric way of thinking and orienting around knowing and being. For generations, modernity has taught us to trust its systems, its markets, its institutions, its technologies and forms of knowledge, but these systems are eroding, revealing the harm they were always built on. It's the facade in which we're seeing crack, but the foundations, the logics, the mastery and control, the human exceptionalism and innocence and separability remain largely unquestioned. Vanessa Andriotti from Hospicing Modernity has helped me to learn that modernity's promise of progress worked only in costs that were hidden. Costs carried by land and waters, by communities made disposable, and more than human life that has been displaced or erased. But now those consequences are arriving at our very own door. The harms that were exported elsewhere, spatially, racially, and ecology, are circling back into the place that we assumed were safe. Scientists tell us that we've already breached the 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, and we don't need to list them to understand the message that modernity is not simply in crisis, but modernity is the crisis. We are living inside a system of conflict with the very conditions that make life possible. So I see the question before us as this: how might a decolonial peace building respond to conflict of this scale, of a conflict that includes all of life? I'm not here today able to offer any solutions or quick fixes, but I do take seriously the magnitude and complexity of the collective crisis that we are facing. Cree scholar Kasia Henneque reminds us that this complexity in this time is to unnumb to the collective pain that subsidizes our comforts, and to become sensitized to our complicities and our responsibilities within this pain. This means not only noticing our addiction to feeling good, looking good, and doing good. Habits modernity rewards when channeled through performance, productivity, and self-importance. To show up now, we are being asked to interrupt these very reflexes. Our insecurities, our projections, fragilities, harmful entitlements, our aspirations of certainty, our innocence, authority, and our need for validation. Bearing this in mind, these are not personal flaws. They are the psychological scaffolding of modernity itself. And they keep us from entering the relational work that a peace building with land requires. Bayo Akamalafe writes, "This time is urgent, we must slow down. Not to withdraw or become less active, but to become more capable of sensing the deeper patterns that we are entangled in." Slowing down in this sense is the work before us, because it asks us to reconfigure our very will, to loosen our attachment to the kinds of doing good that comforts us and rewards us, or reaffirm the stories we tell about who we are. Instead, it invites a will shaped by responsibility rather than reassurance, a willingness to stay with mess, uncertainty, and grief, and not detour from it. And when we accept this invitation, something else becomes visible. The disturbance being called for is generative, but not easy. It asks us to develop stamina for paradox, for not knowing, and for remaining in relationship even when nothing is resolved. To do that, we have to interrupt what I'll call our colonial habits, our discomfort with the unknowing, our intolerance for ambiguity, and the fantasy that if we just think hard enough or work hard enough that we can master our situation. Again, these habits aren't personal failings, they're muscle memory of modernity. And so the map is not the territory, and logocentrism and peace is what we'll begin to talk about. One of the places where these habits become especially visible is in the way we make sense of our world. Because when we follow down its deeper roots, we find that modernity has taught us to treat knowledge as certainty and as control, as something we can hold at a distance. Alfred Korzybski reminds us the map is not the territory and the world is not the thing. So much of what we do in this university, even in our justice work, is mapping. We world the world, we theorize and we categorize, conceptualize and define, and modernity often rewards this and teaches us that if we can name something clearly enough, if we can package it up in tidy descriptions, and if we speak about it with enough confidence, we have understood it and perhaps even mastered it. But maps are not relationships, and words are not the land. And no amount of conceptual clarity can substitute for the messy relational work of tending to conflict, to collapse, and to grief, and to one another. In this way, our need for clarity and desire of mastery becomes an avoidance technique and inhibits us and our ability to transform the very realities we are attempting to engage with. While it is not only here, it is amplified here. Within these walls, students like myself are taught to reproduce logocentrism, place value on logos, reasons, words, and speech as the foundation of meaning. We name, define, analyze, and categorize as if the world needs our description to be considered real. Through subject-object binaries, with only some humans considered as subjects, tidy data and authorized methods, we render our version of reality and silently disregard what falls outside of that as untrue, unscientific, or invisible. The container for this worldview is human exceptionalism. The belief that humans, especially humans in particular positions, are uniquely capable of seeing, understanding, and fixing the world. Even amid climate collapse, pandemics, rising fascism, we cling to this conviction. It lets us feel good, look good, and do good, and hold on to the illusion of control. But we are reminded by Collins and Glover from Collateral Language that this language that shapes public opinion is the same language that burns villages, besieges populations, and leaves land carried and covered with bomb craters and landmines. Logocentrism organizes the link between language and violence. English is a noun-heavy grammar. It tends to freeze the world as things. Many indigenous languages, including Mi'kmaq, are verb-rich, accenting process and relationship. What Nora Bateson would recall as the pattern that connects. So I'd like to pause here and identify the temptation to treat this as content or as something to grasp onto. Instead, let's interrupt the map and take a moment to breathe, to notice how you're feeling and how your body is responding to the conversation. Whether you hold tension in your shoulders, you breathe sighs of relief of hearing something maybe you've already known or suspected. Maybe discomfort or confusion is stirring, or maybe curiosity is beginning to creep in. This pause is not just pedagogy, it's a tiny peace practice. Because peace building, if it is for all of us, requires that we notice how modernity's logics live within our own nervous system, not just out there in conflicts, policies, or wars. We often imagine that peace building belongs to specialists, peacekeepers, diplomats, or mediators. But Roger McGinty offers a wider view: everyday peace. Everyday peace is the small acts of care. It is the resistance and the relational tending that ordinary people, like us, participate in our daily lives. And this often can go unnoticed. If we look at everyday peace, we can understand ourselves as everyday peace builders. If peace is relational, why would we limit this to just humans? After all, land is already engaged in a continuous peace work. Forests adapt to militarization, rivers reroute themselves around pollution, and animals shift their migration routes while communities change their planting practices, all based on the same kind of danger. This work is often slow and mostly quiet and ignored. But this is the basis of our continuity and the very promise of life. Harm is also quiet. It is normalized and seemingly everywhere. We look around the room, the walls and the chairs, and where do these materials come from? Whose land and whose labor? What tensions do they hold? What histories do they carry? The peace we experience here is braided with violence everywhere. Conflict zones and comfort zones are not separate. They are entangled. You may already be aware of the principle, do no harm. This is a very well-intentioned pillar within the practice of peace building. But land knows the truth. Harm is inevitable. Our presence, our consumptions, and our institutions all have impacts. So the question, I think, is not so much how do we avoid harm, but how do we become more conscious of the harm we are already causing? How do we relate to it differently? How do we practice accountability instead of denial? Because once we see that harm is inevitable and that conflict is relational, systemic and ecological, and that modernity has left us half blind, something new must enter. If we listen carefully, we might have heard the exiled epistemologies whispering at the door of Mulrooney Hall. This would be Elder Albert Marshall and his wife, Elder Merdina Marshall. They have been there waiting for us for over 30 years, carrying the messages of Etowaptamuck. Two-eyed seeing is a call for the next steps in peace building. For peace builders, those trained to enter conflict zones and those who carry the longing to mend what has been broken. Two-eyed seeing offers a widening of this field, and it teaches us with one eye to see the structural, historical, and political and systematic conditions, the kinds of conflict you are trained to address. And with the other eye, we see the relational, ecological, and spiritual dimensions, the conflicts that exceed our approaches and frameworks, and the ones that we feel in our bones, the ones that land has been speaking for generations. Together, these eyes create a kind of depth perception, a way of perceiving conflict that is not flattened by analysis or traumatically overwhelmed by emotion. Two-eyed seeing does not replace peace building. It deepens and it grounds it. And if we hold it carefully enough, I think we can recognize that two-eyed seeing is the foremost practice of peace building. Across genocide, ecocide, and epistemicide, it is the path toward a way of living as the land a time of both historic and ongoing rupture. John Paul Lederach's little book of conflict transformation invites us into a very important shift from resolution conflict, or to resolving conflict, ending, closing, and fixing, towards transformation. Transforming it is to center relationships and an ongoing process. But even with this conscious transition, the relationships Lederach centers are mostly human, between individuals, communities, and institutions. If we follow conflict down to its deeper roots, another truth will appear. Conflict is ecological. Conflict is power and land, resources and authority, as well as governance. These are not abstract issues. They reflect the architecture of colonial modernity. Borders that are drawn without consent, inequalities that are built into law and infrastructure, and decision-making often restricted to the very few. Peace building often functions as a medicine to stabilize these systems and to soothe the symptoms of institutions. Even as these structures of disposition remain intact, war is treated as an interruption to an otherwise acceptable normal. But from the land's perspective, normal is the wound. So when we say we need to bring conflict, transformation, and land together, we are not simply adding environmental perspectives to an existing human framework. We are naming the substrate of the conflict itself. We are reorganizing land as a participant and not simply a backdrop. As a living being who has endured violence, adapted, recognized, and carries memory. And this recognition asks a deeper question than how do we integrate ecology into peace building. It asks us, how do we relearn to listen to a participant whose language is not speech, but rather pattern, season, moss, flood, fire, and silence? This is where peace building stretches and becomes less about managing conflict and more about mending relationships in an ever-changing world. From conflict tree to two-eyed seeing as practice. Peace builders often use the conflict tree diagram to analyze conflict choices and consequences. The roots are understood as underlying causes and the trunk as visible tensions. The leaves as surface symptoms that are helpful. This is a helpful outline, but it remains a map. Two-eyed seeing invites us to lift our eyes from the diagram and look to the actual tree, to step from abstraction to the living, breathing world. I skipped way ahead. We'll go back. Maybe I didn't. I did. Two-eyed seeing invites us to lift our eyes from the diagram and look at the actual tree. To step from abstraction into territory, the living, breathing, unpredictable world. Environmental issues have been identified as both drivers of violence and conflict, and as entry points to collaboration and peace building. Some would argue environmental peace building is because some would argue the Environmental Peacebuilding Organization because natural resources are one of a country's most critical assets. Land, forests, minerals, and water are often the resources and the foundations for rebuilding livelihoods and national economies. However, ecologist Suzanne Simard's understanding of the land in its full aliveness, not the land as a concept, interrupts modernity and teaches us that intact forests are not collections of units, but communities of tending. Mother trees can send carbon signals through its mycorrhizal networks to nourish its seedlings. They can reduce their own root competition to make space for their kin. And when injured or dying, they can send messages of warning signals to prepare the next generation. The mother tree increases the resilience of a whole community. Nora Bateson reminds us that this way of treeing is an ongoing event woven from millions of relational interactions. The forest is not a set of individuals, but a pattern that connects. It is not natural resources rebuilding national economies. It is more than human peace building. This is the land participating in conflict transformation. Let us be careful here. Even though we know that harm is inevitable, it is the harm we cannot bear to notice and the harm that moves through us unseen that becomes most dangerous. This means peace building with land is not yet another virtue to perform or another task to accomplish. Peace with land is the presence of accountability, a posture of turning back toward the place where our lives have left deep marks, and choosing to remain in relationship what we find here. So I invite us to ask, what kinds of impacts are we having? And what kinds of impacts is the land absorbing because we are here? You ask sincerely, and you are practicing two-eyed seeing. You are listening beyond words. To be humbled by an intelligence older than analysis. To feel moss on your hands, not just concepts in your mind. Let us speak briefly of trauma. Psychologists note that children of war often carry traumatic memory in their bodies, and this burden often shows up in contexts of their play. Indigenous scholar Eduardo Duran calls trauma a soul wound, an injury not just to individuals, but to a collective being. If we understand ourselves as land then trauma is also an injury to the land's consciousness carried through us. Duran writes, the destruction of land is an injury sustained by the consciousness of earth. Our bodies, he says, become the instrument through which land expresses its pain. This helps us to understand something about one another. We feel what is happening even if we cannot articulate it. Our dysregulation and our grief, our sense of foreboding is not simply psychological states. They are ecology signaling, moving through the human nervous system. When we hold our inherent relationality, trauma becomes a braid, the psychological, social, and the ecological. Land stores memory of harm, but also the possibility of regeneration. If this is what trauma looks like in human lives, we can also see it in the wider world. Consider Gaza, the Ukraine, Sudan. These cycles of destruction shatter not only people, but soil, aquifers, orchards, and ancestral places. This is not merely a political conflict. This is a repeated wounding of an entire ecology. So we must ask, how are our lives here made comfortable by devastation? And how do media narratives word the world in ways that render land's injuries invisible? Two-eyed seeing does not dismiss the human struggle for land, not in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, or here in Turtle Island, where people have endured generations of disposition. Two-eyed seeing honors this struggle. It insists that land too be a part of the story, that survival, dignity, and the rights of Indigenous peoples here and worldwide are inseparable from the healing of soil, aquifers, and the orchards, and the olive groves that have been shattered alongside them. Land's rights do not compete with human rights. They deepen and ground them and remind us that peace is ecological, and it has to be ecological to be real. Because we know trauma held in land leaks into human lives through poisoned water, dead soil, raised forests. And this creates despair, illness, sometimes numbness, and even within myself, sometimes rage. My generation, I think, feels this intimately, the difficulty of imagining our futures, and the often unnamed tremble in our nervous system. This is not separate from conflict. This is land expressing the pain of violated relationships through us. But Kimmer notes in Braiding the Sweetgrass that even when land is wounded, she is still feeding us. So I see composting as a peace practice. We cannot reconstruct our way out of this because reconstruction is a child of modernity. A belief that if we build hard enough, if we think hard enough and plan well enough and engineer deliberately enough, that we can return to something called normal. But normal is the wound and normal is the violence. Normal is the agreement in which land's pain is unseen and people's pain is political. So peacebuilding now must become something different. Something maybe more humbler, maybe more slower, and certainly more creaturely. It must become composting. Composting is the act of not knowing. It is the art of letting what is dying break down, of offering our illusions, our certainties, our reflexes for control back to the soil, of trusting that decomposition is a part of the rhythm of life. Two-eyed seeing doesn't give us a model. It simply teaches us to ask questions of someone who is willing to be changed by relationship. So ask not what we shall build, but rather what is land ready to host? What must be mourned before anything new can grow? What needs to decompose and not simply out there, but in here as well? Composting is peace building without mastery. It is the act of listening and giving up, relinquishing our human exceptionalism and arrogance. It is tending to what lives beyond the maps of our world. None of what I have said today fits nicely inside modernity, and it'll not be applauded by efficiency metrics or strategic plans. because it asks us not to design our way out, but to become our way in. To become people who can stay with trouble, who can listen to the land, people who can live inside uncertainty without grasping for control. To become people capable of relationships even amongst collapse. And so I leave with this. Can we remember that we are all land? And then that conflict moves through us as much as through nations. Can we hold that peace is not simply a product, but a posture? Not an outcome, but a constant practice. It is not the absence of harm, but the presence of accountability and care. And as Bayo says, the times are inviting us to slow down so we might notice the paths emerging beneath our feet that were never visible at modernity's speed. Nora Bateson might whisper that our work now is to connect the patterns and to notice the patterns that connect. The patterns that compost us into something wiser. Thank you, Walalio. Thank you for listening with your bodies and with the land, and maybe with eyes you perhaps you never knew you had.
For a moment, I'm going to put aside my instructor hat and share with you what I was taught, which is when wisdom speaks, when humanity speaks, when the land speaks, when the water speaks, there are no responses. As Emma said, silence becomes the language. So just absorb what Emma has shared with us. Take a few seconds. But before I turn into, if you have any questions for Emma, or comments or suggestions, I'll share one question Emma posed to me during one of our classes. She said, I'm trying to paraphrase the question. She said, is peace building our human effort to atone to our own cruelty, to atone to our own crimes? And instead of saying no more war, instead of saying we shouldn't be doing violence, why are we going through the path of peace building? Doesn't peace building normalize war? Because we have toolkits here, but we continue with violence. When things go bad, we move into the peace building pattern. I don't pretend to be a teacher, but if a student are not questioning your framework, the learning is not honest. I built my entire career around peace building. Here comes a young woman. What is this? What are you doing? And I went home and I shared with my wife. And I said, Emma asked me this question. Are we trying to atone to our own sins, to our own destruction, by making us feel good? We are doing peace building. So, you know, I have responsibility to, grade Emma and do the whole administrative university thing required, but how do you grade this? What does grading mean in this context? So there are moments where you feel hope has been manipulated, hope has been commercialized, hope has been politicized, and yet you sit here in front of Emma and you see hope in a tangible way, real time, live. So it's not about a teacher-student relationship. It's that relationship she talked about over and over and over again. And when we began our class, I have my own definition of peace building, which is peace building is the art of building a relationship that's rooted in dignity and respect. But Emma's question is, where does the respect for the land, the water, the sea, the sky, the trees fit into this human conception of respect? So because of where I'm trying to re-examine my whole formative years, what I've been learning, what I've been reading, and what I've been doing. I will stop here, and I have a few questions for Emma, but anyone with questions, comments, and suggestions? I must also confess that there is another person who is involved with that relationship with Emma, student, teacher, I don't know what the right language is, Riley Olstead. Any comments, any suggestions, any questions? Peter?
That's good. They're congratulating, very good. We form a peace with the land, but this land, people come and go. This land has seen a lot. The land remains through its changes. We see changes in our own community with land. I know, and I remember when the new highway was going through, I've been working on campus here, it'll be 28 years in the. And over in the building that I'm over in, close to the old highway, it's a cemetery, in the cemetery. There was always wildlife in those areas. Across the road. And traveling on the new highway, you see more animals that have been struck by vehicles and that, so our progress has brought harm to another. To our relations with animals. From that, so, but the land still remains. We had to adjust some of the animals, right? Don't run out in front of those flashing lights, slow down when you're on the highway. But the land will still be here when we're long gone. It was here for our relatives, our ancestors, it was here for the animals, it will be here for the animals yet to come, and for our ancestors yet to come. But what will it look like in 20 years' time? But the land will still endure. It will absorb everything that is thrown at it, as it has so far.
I talked a little bit in my presentation about Bioakamalafe, and he's someone who has been recently introduced to me by my friend Riley Olstead. And as I was watching his videos, he described something that he called the threshold. And he described these moments as poetry, and not because they were written in rhyme, but because they offered moments that lacked control and mastery. And often in these moments, there was a failure of speakability. So I think a big part of the discussion we're having today is a threshold into something else that we don't necessarily know how to put words to.
Anybody? Let me pose a question to you. So I get paid, sort of. Oh, sorry.
Emma, I was pleased when you bring in that whole thing that we harm. Because to live means we have to take. it also means we have to give. So I think rather than saying, do we do harm or not do harm? Even maybe using the word harm is the wrong word. Because it's like, in order for us to live, to be, we need to take from everything else. But we also then need to give. That's what we've been doing. So I was really pleased that that was part of your presentation.
You go ahead, no, I guess it's probably.
That was good. And I think the compost idea is absolutely great. When we think about our connection to land and land's connection to us, and particularly how land goes through generations. I studied gut microbiome, and I came because I want to write something about. So if your microbiome, that is a network. It's also a distributed network through the body, but then it's distributed outside the body through the land. And the microbiome is the one thing that is passed from a human to human. So the child has your mother's microbiome, and it largely remains unchanged. By 80% different. And I think that when we think about change, that is the mechanism in which we can change the human. And the only way to do that is on food. That brings you back to land. So that's your circle. And that's what I was looking for when I did. I don't know you were. Just saw the title and I said, that's it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here. This idea of composting isn't mine. And I'm actually not sure. Wherever it is Vanessa Andreotti in Hospice and Modernity talks about this, and actually my first introduction, I have no science background whatsoever, but I took an amazing course with Riley and that's how we met, and it was a health justice course. And I remember the day Riley told us in her class, she was talking about our microbiome, our gut microbiome, and how they're different to every person, and once we lose something in that biome, we can't ever get it back. And so I rushed home and I didn't rush home. I guess I rushed to my home and called my parents and I was like, did you know like the tomatoes you ate 20 years ago aren't the same kind of nutrients like I'm getting from my tomatoes this year? And that if I lose this, I won't have the ability to give this to my future children. And that was something that I didn't actually have the language then to understand, but through these conversations with Digafie and Riley and Donna and Marion and Joanne and Joan, I realized that with this came a lot of grief, and a lot of grief that I don't have control over this, and my food is something I rely on from the grocery store, and I have no capacity to cultivate it myself. I have no understanding of how that happens because my parents work 2 full-time jobs and I go to school and I come home tired and I probably go to bed and spend too much time on my phone, and it's scary to think that I don't have control over those things and that these things could be gone and that I could be losing things and not have the capacity to give them to future generations. So yeah, that grief, that composting is an idea we've been learning from Andreotti, and along with that, so many other things and so many emotions that come with that. So thank you.
At risk of conversing in Q&A.
Yeah.
You could provide yourself a little relief. That's two things can be true at the same time. Yes, your microbiome might be like a fingerprint, but every meal you had modulates your microbiome. Every time. Spend 2 years eating nothing but food from farmer's market, and your life will change.
Yeah. And this is why we need two-eyed seeing. Because we need a little science along with this understanding.
Joanne?
I just, thank you. You do teach well, always. And I'm like you, I'm sitting here saying, wait a minute, everything I learned, I've got to like kind of, wait a minute, wait a minute. But the one thing though that I appreciate deeply is even to use letterhead, because often for me, in my experience, he's been put off as a fluff version of peace building. But for me, the gift that he brought, and I think you really deepened, is that acknowledgement of vulnerability. And that if we do not acknowledge our own vulnerability and recognize it in Earth and in others, we'll never get anywhere. And I think that's a real gift. So just keep deepening that. That nothing will change if we can't acknowledge our vulnerability with each other and the vulnerability of Earth. I think Earth is always teaching us our own vulnerability. So thank you.
Yes.
Hi Emma, amazing presentation. I was just wondering, when did you start your journey to peacebuilding? Amazing question. Ella has been sitting with me constantly for hours. You would not believe the time she has spent listening to this presentation. This might just be the 55th time she's heard it. And this is probably the 77th question she's asked. Peace building is a topic that I only became to understand when I started to have conversations with Digafie, and Digafie and me met during a seminar I was hosting with a class with Kennedy, and we were talking about two-eyed seeing and how that related to the circular economy. And that was when, yeah, I had missed Digafie's class, and he came up to me and said, "Stop by my office. I'd like to know more." And I did. I went and I took him up on the offer, and I stopped into his class and then every other office in the hall and had these conversations and started to understand peace building a little bit as a framework, but then as we sat and as our classroom time turned into, rather than an hour, into 2 hours, and we'd sit and we'd talk and I'd ask questions, and these amazing knowledge navigators I have around me, which is every single one of you in this room, I think. Like I said at the start, they sit with me for very long periods of time, or maybe short periods of time, but they don't direct me in a certain way. They just kind of hold me in my understanding and the questions I have, and relating it to my work with the Martha Justice Ministry, or the collaboration with the Development Studies Department, or the collaboration with the Sociology Department. And I sit and Digafie helps me braid and weave all this together, and he gives me these questions and these papers and these ideas, and I start to understand peace building as a practice of everyday life. And that's how I picked out to focus on everyday peace building, because every other aspect of peace building somehow winds up making me feel a little isolated. Like that global peace building feels a little untouchable and something that I'm not sure that I'm ready to put my foot into yet. And I wonder, like I said in the beginning, what I can offer here. And so all I can offer is the everyday, is the personal and the intimate kind of peace building, and the kind of forgiveness that goes along with the work of peace building.
Good question.
Great question.
Let me say one quick thing, and I mean, most of you know Emma. We have a class on Mondays and Wednesdays. Just before that, the course Peacebuilding the 21st Century was supposed to be offered to all university students last year, but we didn't get enough registration, so it was canceled. She comes to me and she said, "Well, can I have this course as directed study?" That was her idea. And I talked to my program director, Martha, and she said, "Well, let's talk to the faculty and, sort out a few things." So I emailed people around, and they said, "Yeah, sure, she can take it." So that's how she ended up being, it's her own initiative. When the course was canceled, I said, "Okay, I'm going to have a free semester. I don't have to work." But she said, "No, we're going to do it a different way." And we did. But the other thing is about Emma is this. She will come to class on Mondays and Wednesdays, one-on-one in my office mostly, or downstairs, second floor, in the hub. And she will come and we'll finish class. And she said, well, that was a wonderful class. I'll see you next class. And she'll leave. But I will hear her voice an hour later in the hallway. She's talking to everybody. Every person on that floor. The reason why I'm raising this is we talk about relationship building, but relationship building requires skill, requires effort, requires putting time, spirit, and energy. And she does that all the time, nonstop. So let me ask you a question before I ask people what questions they have. During our class, we went through the Ubuntu, what Ubuntu is, and Ubuntu is, we all know that sometimes it's called African theology, sometimes it's called African philosophy, whichever. But during our study, we sort of tried to put a parallel mirror between two-eyed seeing and Ubuntu. Can you add a little bit on that, your reflection on Ubuntu and two-eyed seeing, how they come together and how they go different directions?
Ubuntu, as I've been learning to understand, is the concept of understanding that I am what I am because of what we all are. And this exceeds every truth with every relationship I have with every being, whether they're in this room or not. Two-eyed seeing, as Elder Marshall sometimes describes it, is the act of listening to every perspective and to gather these and braid them together in order to come together in a relational way. And I think Ubuntu is kind of the philosophy that maybe, I don't want to say wraps it all up, but I think it hosts a different kind of understanding, and it also has helped me to understand that whether you call it two-eyed seeing, and Elder Marshall will say this too, whether you call it two-eyed seeing or you call it Ubuntu, it's really what I think Digafie talks about in his definition of peace building. It is whatever helps you build relationships built on dignity and respect. And those relationships I view as both with land and with people and with the materials in our classroom. And I think Ubuntu has been something that has helped me understand, and the way of presenting, and it flows through things unconsciously. And like two-eyed seeing, it's a verb. So when I started off by saying you're hearing my voice, but what it really is a collection of all these other voices and these other knowledge navigators, because to call them teachers is to reduce them to something institutional, and they certainly are not. They're my mentors, and they offer me, all of you, something that goes beyond Western education or the idea of knowledge. Ubuntu and two-eyed seeing and our conversations don't ask us to give output to what we receive as input. They ask us to just sit silently, I think.
Brian, are there any online questions? No? Okay. Are there any more questions here? Yes.
Thank you, Emma. Big thank you. I think when I listened to all of those, and I think I personally believe that there's no peace building if we don't do it within ourselves. And so when we talked at the beginning about the concepts and trauma, and I guess the relationship part is that can be in our head, the learning. How do we take that into our heart? Yeah, and I have a good example of that. My relationship with the land has certainly been okay, but I was at a conference on water. And Elder Josephine was there. She has since passed. She was the person who walked all the lakes. And she gave the presentation and she was talking about water, her relationship with water. And that's the first thing she does every morning is have a drink of water. To take that into herself and then to breathe it out. And for me, I probably heard all that stuff before, but there was an experience there with someone who really carried that. And then, do I really believe that? Certainly know about mining, social justice and stuff, and what we do to the earth. But it's deeper than that. It's, do I really believe that I can bring peace in a relationship? I don't think we can bring it. And also just another example. I wasn't around when Fiona happened, but anyways, outside my window was a gorgeous tree.
So.
And I called it Sophia. And I just love that. I could look out the window and you could see the birds, whatever. And when that happened, they didn't call me and tell me about when they drove up to the house. Sophia was uprooted completely. There was a tree, 2 down from that we had transplanted literally from Bethany property. Literally transplanted tree. And from halfway up, it was, I used to say, I don't think that tree's gonna make it. I do believe and it took me a while, the underground relationship with trees and how they nurture each other. And what you do to one, you really somehow do to. But my experience was when they really took Sophia away, the next year, I used to say, just pass some of your life on. Don't go. That tree, if you ever drive up by Bethany, it's on the corner of Marion Community, is beautiful. And I think you can either say, oh yeah, that's nice, or garbagey, but it's real. And I guess, what am I saying? I'm at the other end of life, so it's a little easier for me to feel. But it's that personal feeling about all of that. It's not just what we know, and you said that so clearly. This transforming and not knowing. It just came from a thing on basic income for federal government. And I mean, there's so many things that we don't know right now in our world. And yeah, so I think you laid all that groundwork and about the trauma. And I think the thing about not remembering it, at the UN, there was a group there from Africa, and they're having a fight when they would have the tires and put people in it and set it on fire. Horrible, horrible, even to think it. And there was a psychologist there who said, you know what, this was 20 years after. I can't believe these children who would have been infants then are playing that way. And it's that universal unconscious, I guess, that we're all part of. So anyway, that's not, but yeah, thank you for putting that all up there.
I'm glad you shared the story of Sophia, because I didn't want to take the honor away, but when I was writing and including, that I had to go to Riley to remember what Riley had told me about the trees communicating. I wanted to add that in purposefully because I've had the pleasure of meeting Sophia, and me and Marion were on a retreat not too long ago, and she brought a piece of Sophia and she introduced her, and I bawled and I was just like, this is amazing. And Marion told us her stories, and Marion also shared with me one time when we were having a conversation, she was telling me about the stories of her experience in social work and her life, and she said something to me that was very simple, but I thought a lot about in the process of writing the presentation about how you need to meet people where they're at. And I thought about that, and I'm thinking about land, and I thought, when you brought Sophia and you explained her story, I thought how true to Marion to go meet not only the people where they're at, but to go meet the tree and meet Sophia and to bring her memory into spaces such as this one, because I think when we talk about wording the world rather than in tight definitions like isotope tracing and carbon transmission, I think that easily can be understood when we tell the story of Sophia. So
Thank you. I think we need both.
I think we need both. I think we need both.
Yeah, wonderful presentation, and yes, I'm gonna talk a little bit about your pedagogy, because I think it is. You know, this place is filled with lecture halls and lecterns and words and people talking words at people. You're being around, and that's the only way you can do a course, and I think your presentation wouldn't have been half as good without the pictures. And the pictures really, there's things better than words. And there's things better than talking, you know, by listening is the other side of talking, and I just think Digafie really modeled kind of opening the box, because we do have some, it is a box, but we do have some spaces to open it up and get rid of it, so I just, it's so easy, I mean, we talk about the new consciousness we have to acquire to live in a whole different way in relationality, but so quickly the words can get so dense and alienating and inaccessible, and my first language is English and I can read, but boy, it suddenly, it just feels so that there's a wall, and I think what you really stuck true to, and I think maybe the two I see you, Elder Albert and Merdina, kept it, made it simple without making it simplistic. It took really complex ideas, but you do need the images, you do need the metaphor, and the way that you move your course. So I really applaud you for, and Riley, I know you talk about, you know, the way your classes run, because you're not in a box, you're outside doing things. Somebody and this is what we did a blanket in the combat room in Keating. And there's no chairs, and the instructors, was forensic psychology class, and the instructor was saying how different the space is because they're sitting on mats in a circle. And so, I mean, it's really the kind of disruptive pedagogy that is part of what Coady often does anyway in adult education. But you just made something that's, I think, incredibly accessible. So thank you both for doing that.
Thank you.
I certainly didn't make it on my own. I know I told Digafie this before, but I struggle a lot with school at times and tests, and I have short-term memory loss and I have learning disabilities, and I find it really hard to work in within the academy, and I struggled through all of high school, and I wound up here meeting people like Riley and Digafie and Jovita and Pauline and all of you, and I sit, and like I said, it's changed, and I can notice the change. I can notice like my brain doing these amazingly different things because I'm in the academy, but I'm participating in these kinds of relationships with people that don't require constant output or constant cold data. Like, they don't require me to flatten what I'm learning necessarily in papers or in presentations, but they give me the flexibility to have these conversations. And honestly, this is probably the first thing that I've put together for this peace building class, and there's a couple more things we have to get done, but this semester has just been having all these conversations, and what it's doing for my brain, being able to sit with this for so long and not have this anxiety creep in of this paper I have to get due, or this group project I have to work on, or this certain presentation here. These deadlines don't reduce like my brain capacity to understand or digest these kinds of ways of learning, and it's all around me. And this presentation was much more dense than what you heard today before I had sent it to Riley, and she had gave me some wonderful suggestions and helped me to, because it's really hard. It's really hard to find the way to navigate these topics in ways that honor the core of what two-eyed seeing is, and to like, I'm messaging Riley and I'm like, do I make a presentation? Like, does that disrupt what we're talking about? Does that make it something like too academic, or what do I like, how do I do this, Digafie? And I don't have enough time. And they're always simply like, just find it within yourself, or we'll extend the deadline, or we'll work with you on this and we'll give you the suggestion. So it takes like so many people to help me learn this, and it's been years of participating, but it's very hard to learn how to break out of that way of wording everything into tight definitions, because sometimes they're fun.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I want to comment specifically on one part, but I just want to say that I hope that I have privilege of seeing where you go with this. Because you are brilliant, your interpretation and your way of sharing is so accessible and so engaging. It's a gift. It's a gift to be here and to witness this. But I wanted to speak specifically to the land acknowledgement that you offered at the beginning. And land acknowledgements are things that I think we're all struggling with. How do we do that in a meaningful and authentic way? And to quote you, you just talked about your brain capacity. Well, your brain capacity is absolutely beautiful, because you offered the land acknowledgement, and what I heard helped me situate or resituate myself on these lands, in this place, in a whole different way than I've ever thought of before. And I don't have a question. I just wanted to acknowledge that and to say, I think that's a beautiful gift that you've given all of us, because it's easy to say words. And I think we all say words with really good intention of creating right relation. But what you offered in your acknowledgement today helped us think about how our collection of cells here influences and is a part of and is a recipient and is a, doing action to these lands that our Indigenous brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and neighbors and friends have been caring for time immemorial. And you've just offered me a really different way of thinking about that. And I think it's your authenticity in your relationship with the land that enabled that to be so.
Yes.
I was really interested that the last event that I was at, there are a couple of people in the room that were there as well, but with Elder Marshall, at the end of the event, it was striking to me that people were asked to reflect on the process, and people started putting their hands up and saying, I feel anxiety. And then another person said, I feel anxiety too. And then I realized I feel anxiety too. So we named it as a visitor in the room. It wasn't just a personal anxiety of becoming a teacher. And I just wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit about, so I knew I read what you were going to deliver today, and yet I was visited by grief while I was sitting listening to you, like in a very deep way. And I wasn't sure if other people were visited by that teacher. But I wondered if you would be willing to speak a little bit about grief as a teacher from, I mean, we're having intergenerational conversations here. And you raised this also in your discussion about your particular perspective. And I wonder if you would have anything to say about this. Yeah, I think I'm thinking of the morning me and Digafie had our class on genocide. That was a really weird class, and it was at 9 a.m. and we're talking about genocide in the classroom, and I'm like having a really hard time comprehending what we're doing and what we're talking about. And I know this story, and I know the story most particularly of what's been experienced here on Turtle Island and in these lands and the histories that they hold and the grief that is brought by those stories. But it's not something. It's something that I struggle to put words to. And when we have these really difficult conversations, oftentimes I walk out of the room and I go home and I go on about what we talked about and how angry this makes me. And I kind of take that and something you, Riley, have helped me understand is that you said to me that usually, and what I've said in the presentation as well, is this grief I think that I feel around ecological degradation and the just state of the world in general often goes to rage. I get really upset, I get really angry. And when it's too much, I express it, and I've shared it with some people before, and what Riley said to me is that rage usually sits very closely beside grief. And I never thought of that. And I was like, I'm not sad, I'm mad. Like that's the feeling that's coming forth. But when I really thought about it and what's making me mad is that my family has to experience this too. And that maybe my friends have to experience this, or maybe little people growing up won't get to know the fireflies. And that's something we talked about in our climate, land, and future class that April Prosper shared with us, that they're worried. They're worried about the fireflies and that this might be the last generation. And this has so many effects, and this touches everything. This touches everything in ecology, whether we know it or not. Like we are affected by this. And so how I deal with this is I go to my knowledge navigators. I go to Paul and I will ask questions, or I'll listen to his stories, and I'll get a hug probably, and it'll make me feel better for a while. And I'll go to Digafie and I'll say, like, what is this? Why are we talking about this in a classroom? Like, this is insanity. Like, why is this even a subject of conversation? How has this happened? And they, again, don't rush me to solutions, because there's no answers and we don't fully understand it. And I don't know if we have the capacity in our language to express what it really feels like. And when I write, I struggle to, and I have to recall all these feelings. I have to totally rewire my senses to not simply what people want to hear or what I want to say, but how did I feel in this moment when Paul shared his story with me? Like that felt really warm, that felt really good, that made me feel better. So how do I take this presentation and warp it into something that can feel warm and not cold or not scary? Or what we talk about a lot too is not moving into a state of panic, because panic doesn't help, and sometimes it's inevitable to feel that way, but it's a big balancing act. But when there are so many people holding your hand on this tightrope, it makes it easier. And as I've developed all these relationships, I find this anxiety slipping away. And I find I don't get nervous to speak in front of people, or I don't get nervous to hand in a paper anymore, because I have relationships that I can go back to, and I have stories that I can call on, and I have people to see in the hallway and smile at, and none of this really matters because it wasn't what we were ever meant to do. So it's it's listening.
Yes.
I loved your question and I loved your answer, because it's stirring something in me, and I think it is a rage of how much is happening in our world that is outrageous. And part of me says we're letting it happen.
you know, I have a name on that, and one of it's Trump, but I don't wanna go there, because it's bigger than that. But it's how do we, stay peaceful in such turmoil? And know that's who we're meant to be. And I think you probably hit the answer on the head when you talked about who your companions were. It's being in the company of people who are calm and have trust this. I think it's about relationships. I think it's about relationships that are on the same page or are safe to be where you can say the rage. Because I don't think I'm the only one that's raging. But yeah, it was very enlightening for me this afternoon from many perspectives. And I do think it really speaks of how you dug deep into this topic. And you not only turned the sod of earth, you turned the sod of our minds and thinking. It has just been, but thank you.
Any last questions, comments? Okay. When I talk about peace building and becoming an instructor for peace building here in Antigonish, Coady and Fairfax, I want to acknowledge there are people who made it possible for this to happen. And they know who they are. And I'm referring to Sisters of St. Martha. Their commitment to peace, hospitality, community is not some kind of surface level, superficial, logistic thing. It's a serious commitment. Annie and I moved here because of that. And we found home here. And there was a staff meeting yesterday, and you know, why do you like working at Coady is one of the questions, if you recall. And my answer was, it allows me to do what I care about. Issues I really deeply care about. And I can do them with creativity and imagination. Nobody can censor me what I can do and what I cannot do. So as we gather here, as we listen to Emma and her description of relationships and coming together, both in spirit, mind, soul, what John Paul Lederach talks about, the heart at the center of conflict transformation. That's why this is possible. Because people think it's important. So I don't want to leave that out, because I didn't happen to be here by accident. I happened to be here, my wife and I happened to be here because some people wanted us to be here. I mean it. And that's why we're here. And that's why how we met Emma, how we met Riley, how we met each and every one of you. If peace building is a relational task, we see it clearly right here in this room. And that's what, at the end of the day, I go home and say, this is a good place to be. So thank you so much for all of you and for your support.